It's my honor to introduce the next panel, which is our keynote address by New York Times op-ed columnist David Brooks, followed by a short fireside chat with Ellie Hollander, two of the greatest thought leaders and experts on building stronger connection and combating social isolation and loneliness. Again, I have the honor of introducing Ellie Hollander, who is the president and CEO of Meals on Wheels America, the national leadership organization supporting the more than 5,000 community-based programs across the country that are dedicated to addressing senior isolation and hunger. Ellie, thank you for joining us today and for introducing and leading the discussion with Mr. Brooks.
My pleasure, Eddie. Thanks for such a generous introduction, and Andrew, for both of you co-sponsoring this very important action forum. I'm more than delighted, to be here because not only is this topic near and dear to me personally, but also the organization and the network that I represent, not to mention that I am a great fan of David Brooks, and I feel that there is really no one better suited to set the stage for today than he. David is chair of WEAVE, the social fabric project at the Aspen Institute in Washington, D.C. He's a New York Times columnist, a commentator on NPR and PBS Newshour, and author of 5 books, including The Road to Character and The Second Mountain. I'm going to turn it over to David to share his thoughts, and then I'll come back to discuss a few questions during our fireside chat. So with that, David, welcome.
Thank you, Ellie. It's a pleasure to be here. Let's try that. And it's great that this event exists. When you go into newspaper column writing, you don't think you're going to be writing about isolation and loneliness and emotional things. You think you're going to be writing about politics and economics and stuff like that. Washington, D.C. is the most emotionally avoidant city on the face of the earth. And so I was totally cool with that. I was ready to lead a nice, emotionally avoidant life. And yet, as I traveled around the country, writing about political polarization, economic dislocation, mass shootings, suicide rates, deaths of despair, everything kept coming back to social isolation and loneliness, and really the tears in our social fabric. And I just wanted to speak briefly about that on 3 different levels. First, on the national level, we all know, I don't have to tell people in this group, the health effects of isolation and loneliness. I just want to make one quick point on the national level. You can be lonely in a crowd. One of the things that alarms me most about the Western world right now, most of it, is the levels of distrust. If you ask people in the United States a generation ago, do you trust the institutions of your society? About a generation ago, people said, yeah, I trust them. About 70 or 80% said yes. Now that's down to about 19%. Worse, if you asked people a generation ago, do you trust the people around you, your neighbors? Most Americans, about 60% of Americans, said, yeah, my neighbors are basically trustworthy. And that's still true in some countries. The Netherlands, 68% trust their neighbors. It's no longer true in the United States and a lot of other countries around the world. 30% of Americans say they trust their neighbors. Most people say they can't trust the people around them. And that's just an existential fear of safety. If you distrust the world around you, you're isolated even when you're near people because you find other people untrustworthy. And the scary part of that statistic is that baby boomers and older people still basically have a fair amount of social trust and trust in each other. The younger you get, the more distrustful you get. So when you get to Gen Z or millennials, only about 19% say the people around them are trustworthy. 71% say most people are selfish. 73% say most people would screw you if they had the chance. Imagine living in a world of that level of unsafety. That's a form of isolation, even if you're around people. And that's a national phenomenon that requires national solutions. The second thing I wanted to talk about is on the community level. I was writing about social isolation and I figured, well, there's a problem being solved at the local level by people I call weavers all around the country. And these are the people working in organizations like Meals on Wheels who are just phenomenal at relationships, phenomenal at connecting people in. Just 2 quick examples. One was a woman I met in Chicago, Aisha Butler, lives in a neighborhood called Englewood, kind of a tough neighborhood, was going to move out because it was dangerous for she and her family. On the day before she was going to move out, she looked across the street at an open lot and saw a little girl in a pink dress playing alone with some broken bottles. And she turned to her husband and said, we're not going to move out. We're not going to be just another family that left this and left these people behind. And so she sent away the moving van. She Googled volunteer in Englewood. One thing led to another, and now she runs RAGE, which is the big community organization in Englewood. It brings people together. It brings people into relationship. And now if you go to Englewood in the stores, they have t-shirts that say proud daughter of Englewood, proud son of Englewood. So they're beginning to create connection where there wasn't. Another organization is called Thread in Baltimore, founded by a woman named Sarah Heminger. Heminger was isolated. Her family was basically sent away and put into exile when, because her parents had exposed to some embezzlement at their church. And so she had an extremely lonely childhood. She went to Johns Hopkins, was getting a PhD in neuroscience. And she was on a bus driving by a high school in Baltimore. And she looked out the window and saw some kids looking extremely lonely outside the school. And she looked out the window and she said, I know exactly how they feel. And so she created an organization called Thread that surrounds hundreds and hundreds of underperforming Baltimore students with 4 volunteers who basically drive the kids to school, give them lunch, serve an extended family. Then there's another circle of another 4 people called grandparents. Then there's 12 more collaborators. Basically, you're creating an elaborate social network around these kids. And so she's creating connection where there was none. And she's just phenomenal at creating cultures of connection. And the 4 basic themes of Thread or organizations are: 1, show all the way up. When you're in a meeting, be fully vulnerable and fully present to people in that meeting. 2, learn from all voices. All problems are so complicated, we need to have all voices at the table heard from. 3, treat relationships as wealth. They're the assets of your organization. And 4, fail forward. Your organization, you're going to fail constantly. And at Thread in Baltimore, they know how to fail forward. And that's something they do together. And so it's a deeply relational organization. And that brings me to just the final point I want to make. I've talked a little about national, a little about community organizations, neighborhood by neighborhood. But essentially, the end of loneliness has to be personal. Emerson once said, souls aren't saved in bundles, they're saved one by one. And loneliness ends when we make a personal connection with somebody else. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about that skill. And I've come to think that the key to every healthy family, classroom, organization, nation, or society is the ability to see someone else deeply and be deeply seen. And somehow we're lacking in that skill. In my reporting, basically what I see is an epidemic of blindness in society. Black people feeling their daily experience is not understood by whites, people looking across the partisan divide at each other in blind incomprehension, rural people not feeling seen by coastal elites, kids in the basement, adolescents who feel that nobody knows them, husband and wives realizing the person who should know them best doesn't see them at all. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about what is that skill? And, you know, I had an experience, my wife was standing at the front door of our house. This was about 6 months ago. And she was standing by, and the door was open. She was standing looking at an orchid, which was next to the front door. And I looked up from some boring book I was reading, and I looked at her, and the light was coming in behind her. And I had the sensation, I really know her. I really know her well. I'm sure you can have this sensation with your spouse or your kids. Just a sense, yeah, I really know that person through and through. And when you know somebody that well and you can make them felt that way, it's not the facts about their lives, it's not the adjectives. It's something about their flowing, it's something about their subjectivity, their consciousness. You know how they respond to the world. You can almost see out through their eyes so you know how they see you. And getting that kind of knowing is something we don't teach in school. We don't really know in society, but it's so important. Just 2 final examples. I have a friend whose daughter was in 2nd grade and she was struggling. And one day in the middle of the year, the teacher said to her, you know, you're really good at thinking before you speak. And that one little comment turned the girl's year around because suddenly she felt known and understood. Something that she thought was a bad thing, her social awkwardness, was actually a good thing. It was thoughtfulness. And so she was known, and loneliness ended for her that day. Now, the final thing, sometimes being known is not the most pleasant thing, but it's always the most useful thing. If you guys remember that movie, Good Will Hunting, Robin Williams plays a therapist and Matt Damon plays this math whiz. And for the first part of the movie, Good Will Hunting, played by Damon, is like going from victory to victory. He's effortlessly solving math problems. He's got verbal wizardry. He's great at stereotyping people and putting them down. And he does this to the therapist, played by Robin Williams. And then if you remember, there's a scene on a park, on a bench. And Williams says, you know, you really hurt me the way you stereotyped me. But I realized you don't know anything. You're just a scared kid. And I don't see a courageous, self-confident man. I see somebody who's afraid to talk about himself because he doesn't know what he's going to say. And the speech goes on. It's a very beautiful speech. It's on YouTube. And Robin Williams says, if you want to talk to me, I'm all in. But if you don't, I'm gone. It's your move. And if you remember that scene, you know how painful it can be to sometimes be seen. But that's a moment when you acknowledge the truth of what has been said about you and you feel weirdly honoring. And so these are just opening comments that on a national level, we have a problem, on a community level, we have a problem, on a personal level, we have a problem. But all three are solved by just developing the skills of seeing each other, of building organizations that see each other, and then mobilizing the resources of government to create those kind of organizations. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, David. Sorry, I was thinking before speaking. I was listening intently to what you had to say. And I want to say, with tongue in cheek, I see you. But I understand exactly what you mean, which is, you know, to unpack everything that you said in such a short amount of time is incredible. But to see someone deeply and to be deeply seen is a great attribute to strive for. And I'm going to really think about that a lot tonight. I think you've stimulated our thinking on this timely and critical topic of social isolation and loneliness. And it's an issue that for decades has been core to what Meals on Wheels is all about, as you mentioned earlier, ensuring that the seniors that we serve are nourished both physically and mentally and through good nutrition and socialization. We always say that Meals on Wheels is more than a meal, that the meal is the entree, if you will, to opening the door to companionship. And it's also equally important as nutrition is. But you have to have the trust, as you mentioned earlier, to be able to be invited into someone's home, to be able to engage. Meals on Wheels, we've been working to enable local programs to augment their in-person daily visits with additional opportunities for social engagement, including friendly visitor and telephone check-in programs, pet assistance programs, and more recently, tech-based interventions. But nothing replaces the power of social connection, of human-to-human connection. And the need has never been more apparent than now amid a global pandemic in which millions more across all age groups are now experiencing social isolation. You know, previously more hidden, a silent epidemic really. I'm glad to see it being exposed, to be brought to the fore so that it can be addressed head on. And I'm really pleased that we're part of this multi-sector effort to seek and to put into action solutions to scale to the magnitude of this issue. So David, segueing to our fireside chat without the fire, you know, there are a number of individuals and organizations listening in today who may be on different paths and different places in that continuum of that journey. But for those who are beginning to embark in this area to address social isolation and loneliness, do you have any advice or recommendations on where to start or how to begin?
Yeah, some of it is just creating a good technology of convening. And you guys do it through food. And that's a common table. You put a table, people eat around food, and that's a technology of convening. There's a group called Becoming a Man in Chicago. And they take young men who are gang members, and they have what they call a check-in, where they meet once a week, and they go around the table, 12 guys, and how you're doing intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. And these are gang members who are heavily armored up. And so to be able to unveil themselves in front of members of other gangs is an unprecedented activity. And so they've created a technology of convening. The final one I'll mention is called Roots of Empathy. And what they do is they take young kids, eighth graders, and they try to teach them empathy. And the way they do it is they take a mom and an infant and bring them into an eighth grade classroom. And they have the eighth graders sit around and the baby's crawling around, grabbing for things. And they have to guess what's going on in the baby's mind. That way they learn to what's going on in somebody else's mind. And the most beautiful story from Roots of Empathy was one day there was a kid named Darren who had been held back a couple of years. He'd been through the foster care system. His mom had died. And he was bigger than all the other kids because he was just older. And he asked the mom, "Can I hold your baby?" And the mom was nervous because Darren looked scary. But she gave Darren the baby and he held the baby and he was fantastic with the baby. And he handed it back and he asked a bunch of questions about parenting. And finally he said, "Do you think you can be a good dad if you've never been loved?" And so what Roots of Empathy does is they take kids who are just isolated, have never been in that circumstance, and they give them those kinds of emotional skills. So being able to talk about emotion is something like a middle-aged white guy I'm not comfortable with, but crossing into that ground is just super important, and it's what people are hungering for.
Those stories are amazing, and thank you for sharing them. I'm wondering about, there's so many people that may be suffering in silence that, are often forgotten. They're not visible to most of society. They may not see an opportunity to go to one of these sessions. Any suggestions on, how to reach out, how to connect with those individuals who may be, behind closed doors?
Yeah, a lot of it is shifting your norms about how you think it is to be a neighbor. Like we ran into a woman at Weave, we ran into a woman in Florida, and she was helping kids across the street coming out from elementary school. This was pre-COVID. And we asked, "Do you have time to volunteer in your neighborhood?" And she said, "No, I have no time." And we said, "Well, you're getting paid to do this?" And she said, "No." And then we said, "What do you do in the rest of the day?" "Well, on Thursdays, I go to the hospital to bring food to the sick." And then we said, "Do you have time to volunteer?" She said, "No, I have no time." And so for her, that's not volunteering. That's just what being a neighbor is. And just even inviting your neighbors out to your apartment or whatever is part of, it's a shifting of a norm. And I grew up in New York City, we have a norm where you don't talk to people because there's so many of us. But if you shift your norms, you can really have a dramatic effect on society. So that's the first thing. The second thing at Weave, what we try to do is lift up people like yourself, frankly, people who are really trying to create connection. And the people we lift up, they never talk about, I'm not doing things for people, I'm doing things with people. Sense of radical mutuality, radical hospitality. And they are the greatest people to be around. They're just, they're joyful. But what we've learned is you have to help the people who are in the neighborhoods. The people who live in the neighborhoods where they work are the ones who are trusted. And they're the ones who know what to do. But often at the neighborhood level, they don't have access to the foundations and the resources. So what we've done is we have some access to foundations and resources. We're good at finding the people at the neighborhood level who are trusted and who know who's lonely down the street. And so we've got to transfer resources from the national level to neighborhood by neighborhood by neighborhood to the trusted people who already live there.
Yeah, it's interesting. We talk at Meals on Wheels, it's helping one person at a time. It's finding those individuals and then the multiplier effect, if you will. It's great. Right now with the pandemic, one of the things that we're focused on is don't stop now. Don't stop checking in on someone that you haven't spoken to. Don't stop seeing if your neighbor's okay. So I think what you're doing is you're talking about taking that to scale, which is really important. Now, shifting a little bit from these stories to the fact that we're in a current environment of racial injustice, the COVID epidemic or pandemic on top of that. What are your thoughts, David, on what perhaps new actions and or policies at the national level are needed to address social isolation and loneliness going forward? Are there any silver bullets out there, anything that you've been thinking about? If we could just do this, I think this would be a great lever to pull.
Yeah, well, first we should acknowledge we're trying to do something really hard. We're trying to build the world's first multicultural, hyper-pluralistic democracy. And in a few years, we'll have no majority group. We'll all be different minority groups. And so we're trying to do something hard. And that's why I think the skill of seeing others across difference suddenly becomes so important. You can't survive as, I don't think government can create relationships, but I think government can create platforms on which relationships can be built. And so, for example, I think a national service program that asked young people to give a year of service for 2 years of free college would get somebody from Mobile in the same room as somebody from Massachusetts. And that by itself would be a win. But then getting them in the habit of serving and making these social connections. I also think it's possible to create that. So many, as I said, the neighborhood is the unit of change. But government can create endowments where local civic leaders shift resources to people who are in the neighborhoods. And you can have sort of a Peace Corps for people already in the neighborhoods doing that kind of civic work. We can also turn schools into community hubs. Right now, schools are often much more isolated within the community and not really hubs of community. And so there's a whole series of ways government can come in, hospitals and healthcare. Government can come in and create the platform on which relationships are naturally going to form.
Great. You know, I get asked this question by the media sometimes, and you probably do too, but since we're almost at the end of our time together, which I've really enjoyed this conversation, is there anything that we didn't get a chance to cover that you'd like to impart some wisdom onto the listeners here today?
I've used up all my wisdom now. I would say, you know, I do think we do have to grapple with social media. I mean, in every form of what I think a lot of young people especially are challenged with is there's understanding nowhere but judgment everywhere. And so there's a sense that I'm constantly being judged, and how we see ourselves is how others see us, especially when we're young. And so a sense of how do we get control of that? And I have a friend, before he wakes up in the morning, or before he looks at a screen in the morning, he goes outside and looks at the sky. He's going to get his priorities right. And he has a social media Sabbath, an hour a day a week, month a year, no screens. And so instituting within our own families those kinds of rules is how we get the advantages of the technology without some of the downsides.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think back to your earlier conversation about trust and building trust, and the fact that, as you said, the younger you are, the less trust that you have. I can't help feeling that because technology has been so embraced in lieu of those interpersonal connections, that has really, trust has suffered as a result of that. And just sort of getting back to that, nothing replaces, in my view, that person-to-person contact, which is why this pandemic is so challenging. What we've been trying to do at Meals on Wheels is emphasize the fact that we can be physically distant, but we need to be socially connected. And so with that, I think I'm going to wrap it up and say, David, thank you so much on behalf of all of us for being here. I know how busy you are because I've tried to connect with you many times, and we're just delighted to have you here today. It's a real honor for all of us. And also, I just want to say that you've left me with a lot of food for thought, no pun intended, coming from Meals on Wheels, but a lot to think about and for all of us to think about. So now what I'd like to do is turn it back to Eddie to introduce the next panel. And David, thank you again. Really appreciate the connection.
Thank you. Thanks for what you do.
Right. Wow. Honestly, what an emotionally moving discussion for me. I was texting my colleagues that I actually teared up for a second. It just really got to me. And that's how important and powerful this discussion is and will be throughout the next 2 days. You know, for hearing from two foundational leaders in this space is such an honor. So sincerely, thank you, David, and thank you, Ellie. We're excited to be partnering with you and to be working on this together.